So as we practice this first movement, Pang, we've learned how to sink the shoulder, drop the elbow, extend the arm. We've learned that we're just using class 3 levers in order to get into a position for the class 1 and 2 levers to work. So we sink the shoulder, drop the arm, and drop the wrist so that there is as little mechanical disadvantage when we raise the hands as possible, and that we engage as soon as possible with the mechanical advantage. We talked about sinking the shoulder, dropping the elbow, dropping the wrist, and also sinking the chest and relaxing the waist and opening the back and extending the spine in a way to preserve that centripetal geodesic so that when the opponent pushes, their force gets redirected through the body into the ground. And we've learned to make this as effortless as possible. And we talked about how doing this helps to refine your thoughts and emotions and gives you some profound insight into the nature of the center of the center of intelligence for the body, the center of gravity, and the way in which your posture affects personality. We haven't talked about how that personality can be betrayed in your posture and give an advantage to your opponent. But if you practice reading your own body, your own structure, and you develop an understanding of how posture reflects personality and personality affects thought, then you can start to see and predict patterns in your opponent and to defeat them before the fight even starts. So, as we say, if you want to be able to read your opponent's mind, practice reading your own. But now we want to talk about the hips, because you may have noticed or suspected that there is a subtle change going on in the hips. Now, when we do the form continuously from the beginning, this movement starts from a position where the hips are bent. So we start in a low position because we've done this and then drop the hands. And so the next movement would be this. We'd already be in a low position. But when we practice Pang in isolation, we start with the legs fairly extended, not locked, but extended. And then we sink as the hands go into position. So we start with the legs extended, and then we sink a little as we drop. And there's also a rotation around around one of the hips, and it's the hip that corresponds to the hand that rises. So the Pang hand, the round hand, comes up like this, and as it rises, the left hip drops back a little. Now, if you engage your opponent's force as the hand is rising, you don't engage the opponent's force with a class 3 lever. The class 3 lever is just raising your hand. That's all it does. Class 1 or class 2 levers are this way, meaning their hip rotation. So pivoting around the one hip, this is my class 1 or class 2 lever, depending on which side of the fulcrum your opponent is on. So if the opponent is on this side of the fulcrum and the movement is over here and I'm sinking back on this side, then it's a class 1 lever. If they're on the inside, then it's a class 2 lever. And if they're over here, well, then that's a class 3 lever. We don't want that. So as the hand rises and engages, I can be rotating and I can be affecting my opponent even as I move into position. So this can be effectively applied to a technique. We don't think of it as a technique itself, meaning something we're doing to the opponent. It's a principle, a method of getting there. But we should always be winning. We should start by winning, so that at any point, no matter what happens, we're already winning the fight before the person moves. That's the idea. So we don't think about getting into position so that we can apply a technique. We think about the principle and the alignment, and we see how we can modify and change the position to preserve those principles. That's a roundabout way of saying the stuff works. When the right arm rounds. It comes up palm toward me, fingertips at eye level. As it comes up, the left hip drops backward. So I am pivoting around the right hip as the right hand rises. So this can mean a couple of things. I could be having my weight on the right leg, predominantly on my right leg as I drop my left hip back, or I can be moving my weight onto my left leg as I go back, still pivoting around this right axis. So I'm moving around this axis. This gives me a lever. So if you think of this as the body. So here's the center. That's the sword. That's the center of the body. And these are the two arms on one side. If I pivot around the center, like this, if this is the center and this pivots, then it's moving like a wheel. It centers around this point. So the sword does not move. Okay? So if the sword is still, that's the center line being still. But if I pivot around the axial or axillary line, if I pivot around my right hip here, then the sword moves. See that? So when I raise my right arm, I pivot around this axis, the right arm comes up, and the left hip and the sword move backward a little. And if I do that, here we go. So this stays still, the sword and the left hip drop back. So here are the arms, and there's the center. So if I keep this hip still and the center and the left hip move backward, then I have this going for me. And the right shoulder is attached to this right arm. So this stays still and that moves back. There. If the opponent is out here, then it's a class 1 lever. If the opponent is on the inside, it's a class 2 lever, like that. If I pivot around the center line, like this, then that does not give me much of a mechanical advantage. It can give me a tactical advantage by allowing the sides to move when they need. This is the tendency. You see this a lot in Tai Chi forms, where people are pivoting around their center line. And that can work for you in a lot of cases, but it doesn't give you a mechanical advantage, like putting the fulcrum where the force is.